Chapter 7, Mishnah 11. The Mishnah discusses purchasing a share in an Eruv in advance. A person may give a ma'ah, a small silver coin, to a grocer or baker so that when the other residents of his courtyard come to buy food for the Eruv, he will own a part of the Eruv. That is, the storekeeper will add the portion he paid for, thereby making him part of the Eruv. Although movable objects such as food cannot usually be acquired simply by paying for them, the rabbis allowed it in this case in order to make it easier to make an Eruv. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. The sages disagree. But the sages say his money does not acquire a share in the Eruv for him. According to the sages, no special leniency was made for making an Eruv. Therefore, the portion the storekeeper gave on his behalf never belonged to the person who gave the ma'ah, and he thus has no share in the Eruv. However, the sages agree that if he paid another person who is not a grocer or baker to acquire a portion of the Eruv on his behalf, his money enables him to own a portion of the Eruv food. Since ordinary people do not sell food, the person giving the money clearly intended to pay the other person to be his agent to acquire a portion of the Eruv on his behalf, with the proper method of acquisition, and then gave it for the Eruv. The money he provided was for the service rather than as payment for the food. The ruling of the sages implies that when the person giving the ma'ah pays a grocer or baker, the Eruv is invalid for him if the shopkeeper makes the Eruv himself using his own food and grants possession of it to all the residents of the courtyard or alley, including the person who paid him. The sages explain why. This is because we cannot use a person's possessions to make an Eruv for him without his consent. Since the person gave the money to buy food that was not effective, even if the storekeeper would give food for him to the Eruv collector and grant ownership of it, keeping the money as his fee, that too would not be effective. This is because the storekeeper will be using the person's money in a way he had not been authorized to do. The storekeeper would thus be using that person's money to make an Eruv for him without his consent. This, according to the sages, is not effective. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says, when was it said that we cannot use a person's property to make an Eruv for him without his consent? Only with regard to Eruvei Techumim, because it is not a clear benefit to the owner, since an Eruvei Techumim extends his Techum in one direction, but limits it in the opposite direction. But with regard to Eruvei Chatzerot, which is a clear benefit to a person, since it allows him to carry from his house into the courtyard, we may make an Eruv for a person with or without his consent, because the rule is that we may benefit a person without his consent, but we may not disadvantage a person without his consent.